Hello, magnificent eardrums. It's Monday, 16th of March, 2020, and we do warmly welcome you to the Voicing the World Late Night Noisecast, Episode 3. Doing what we can and what we must to ensure the continuation of feasts of reason, flows of soul, and the seeking of stolen moments of calm in the time of Corona. After an unforgettable and unparalleled day of developments here in London and around the world. A day that almost prevented completion of this recording, but here we are a little later than usual. On the show tonight, we'll be joined down the line from Boston by my special guest and brother-in-arms, Dr. James D. Boyes, a US political historian, analyst for CNN, Sky and the BBC, and author of Clinton's grand strategy, Hillary Rising, and Clinton's War on Terror. As I ask, what processes are the United States likely engaging to complete a presidential election this year, given the present circumstances? Music tonight comes to you from Alex Munk and his Flying Machines, as well as a little noise from Mark Rose and myself, too. I begin then with an abundance of gratitude for your superlative feedback on last Thursday's episode, and present here in part the resulting plan, as we intend to traverse the coming weeks. Both Monday and Thursday episodes each week will feature creative artists in performance industries, and I will always link to and encourage you to collide with, enjoy, and purchase their material. In addition, Mondays will incorporate non-partisan political, cultural, and communications analysis as we traverse these difficult days. In that vein, tonight I'll introduce you to a show format that the aforementioned Dr. James D. Boyes and I used to put out there during my 3.5 years of interviews for 12th Peer Productions, which drew on his political expertise and my own public speaking, speechwriting, and political analysis. The show was entitled The American Chronicle, and I'm delighted to say we'll be restoring the format as a separate podcast once again in this unique, to put it mildly, US election year. A preview of that format for you tonight then, after much-needed calm and beauty from Alex Munk, his band Flying Machines, and their track, Prelude to Elation. Prelude to Elation there, from Flying Machines' wonderful work of art record, New Life. Links below, folks, as usual. Please do make your enjoyment count. Time now then for the aforementioned return of the American Chronicle, in this case Boston Dispatch edition, with Dr. James D. Boyes. When we began this venture in 2016, James lived in London, and he and I would record together frequently. These days, he is based out of Boston, and I was delighted to ask him some questions regarding electoral campaign process in a time of crisis earlier this evening. He began then by introducing us to the key components of dealing with US primaries in the midst of a pandemic.
So here we are. It's the beginning cycle of the 2020 presidential election, and under any other circumstances, the only news in town would be the ongoing primaries and caucuses, predominantly on the Democratic side of things, with Donald Trump clearly not facing any serious opposition for his re-nomination for the Republican Party. Unfortunately, these are not normal times, and the primaries are being totally overshadowed at this point by the coronavirus. Even the last televised debate that was on last night here in Boston between Vice President Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders was totally dominated by the coronavirus, not only the content, but also the context and the setting. It had been moved away from its original location to a studio in Washington, D.C., for the first time since Richard Nixon met John F. Kennedy in the first televised debate. There was no studio audience. Instead, the two candidates duked it out in front of three hosts led by Jake Tapper on CNN. And the content was predominantly based around what reactions they would have and what America should have to the ongoing virus situation. Needless to say, it was far from a fun-filled event. And certainly won't be one for the record books. The president today has effectively said that the governors are on their own in terms of whatever it is that they wish to do. They shouldn't be relying upon the federal government for anything anytime soon. So this really is going to, I think, demonstrate the extent to which this really is a nation of 50 independent states operating under a rather loose federal system.
You mentioned the CNN debate there. As CNN had it, the delegate figures going into last night's debate were Joe Biden at 809 and Sanders at 666. What were your gut predictions on how those numbers would shift and your reaction to the debate as a whole?
So it must be said that Bernie Sanders did exactly what he said he was going to do. When he lost so heavily on Super Tuesday and then its subsequent sequel, and it became very, very clear that he had a virtually impossible path to the nomination, he defied what calls there were for him to step down and instead basically said, look, I'm going to stay in this to keep Joe Biden honest. And at the upcoming debate, I will be asking him, so Joe, what are you going to do about X, Y, and Z? In some respects, some people have suggested it was last night's debate was effectively a Joe Biden rally interrupted by an old heckler asking him what he was going to do about a whole series of liberal dreams. That is effectively not a bad way of looking at this. Joe Biden is clearly the presumptive nominee. There is very little way in which one could see Bernie Sanders moving forward because of the proportional representation system that the Democratic Party has put in place, meaning that even if by some miracle Senator Sanders was to now win every election moving forward in the primary season, unless Joe Biden suddenly started getting less than 15% in each of those, there really is no way to see how Sanders could get the nomination back at this point. And yet he prevails. He believes that he has a core group of supporters that the Biden camp needs to bring into play. He was making a big issue last night, of the fact that any winning Democratic candidate will need to bring a passionate group of supporters to the election in November of this year, have a record turnout. And to be fair to Bernie Sanders, was saying, look, we don't just need the older Democrats who are clearly supporting Joe Biden at this point. We need younger voters, voters of color to come out. Now, whilst it must be said that, quite frankly, Joe Biden already has a strong lock on the black vote and the older vote, it's notable that Bernie Sanders has failed, quite frankly, to make any inroads to the African-American community. He makes a big play about the fact that he has a large youth following, but I think if the primaries this year have shown us anything, quite frankly, it's the old adage that there is no demographic upon whom more money is spent, more time is spent to less effect, quite frankly, than the sub-25s, because they have certainly come out to rallies here in Boston. There was a huge rally for Joe Biden some 2 weeks ago over on Boston Common. Some 13,000 people were down there, and yet he failed to win Massachusetts, coming in second to a surprise surge from Joe Biden. So proves once and for all that crowd size isn't necessarily determinant in terms of who's going to win elections. And at this point, it must be said, I think, that Bernie Sanders is what he has always been, which is a mere spoiler for a moderate centrist Democrat who will secure the nomination this time round, just as, of course, Hillary Clinton did some 4 years ago.
There is a counterbalance argument from the Sanders support camp to your points there, however, in as much as the potential of that the coronavirus might boost Sanders' younger turnout and deplete Biden's older demographics in terms of those who turn up to the polls. Can you speak to the possibility of that outcome, please?
Well, certainly what you're seeing is a number of states now actually postponing their primaries so that those that have been planned are now being pushed back. You can make a valid argument. If Joe Biden is winning these elections because he's winning an older vote, over 65s, and that demographic is being told to basically stay home, don't go out under any circumstances, then okay, fair enough. Then that's going to make life very, very interesting. There are, of course, opportunities to vote in a variety of ways, but certainly if, for whatever reason, the post-65 vote doesn't come out for any reason, that could certainly have an impact upon the primaries moving forward. One would hope, I think, that Bernie Sanders is not hoping for that. You would hope that they would want to have a fair contest. By similar measure, it would be a little bit as though Joe Biden was crossing his fingers and thinking, well, all those college students are going to get sick from all those parties and won't be able to come out for vote for Bernie, and start rubbing his hands together. So there's no doubt that the virus here is having a clear, demonstrable effect upon the content of the debate. It's having a clear, demonstrable effect upon how it is that the primaries are being played out. And of course, who knows what is to come next? If we're seeing primaries being delayed, how long before conspiracy theory starts coming up that Donald Trump might try to postpone the election in November? I'm sure that will remain a conspiracy theory, but it must be at the back of people's minds, the extent to which this unpredictable president might well try to do something unpredictable.
From your closing words there seems to be the potential of a sort of perfect storm that would enable Trump, or that might enable Trump, to circumvent process and remain in office through crisis measures such as this, something that late-night show host Bill Maher, for example, has been saying for some time, that Trump was unlikely to accept any election outcome in 2020 that didn't give him 4 more years. I'd venture we're experiencing a time where lack of leadership demonstrates what real leadership is, and lack of real information is demonstrating quite rapidly now what real information really is. When historically have we found ourselves operating in this kind of theatre in the context of US elections?
That's a great question. I think the attempts to place this into historical context is important. I think the scope of this in terms of a virus, a disease, is unprecedented from what I can remember in the history of this country. When you think about questions about leadership and the idea of two distinct groups of people, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, offering seemingly different approaches to a crisis, I think that the closest I can come to, and one which is in relatively recent memory, actually is to do with the financial crisis in 2008, when you had the collapse of the markets during the election of 2008, when, of course, George W. Bush was the incumbent president. He was term limited, so he wasn't running for re-election. You'd had John McCain emerge as the Republican nominee and Senator Barack Obama as the Democratic nominee. And in the last days of that campaign, John McCain had famously declared that he was going to put a pause on his campaign and call for a meeting at the White House to discuss the situation that George W. Bush graciously hosted and Barack Obama attended. And everybody at that meeting was expecting John McCain, the Republican nominee, to be on home turf, I guess, with George W. Bush, surrounded by Republicans, and to sort of almost lay out, well, here's what we should do about this, and no doubt have support from the president. Instead of which, his career and his campaign folded on that very day, because having called for that meeting, he then asked what Barack Obama had to say about it, and offered no alternatives of his own, and instead gave Barack Obama the opportunity to basically take control of the financial crisis in the White House before he was even elected. And by all accounts, his performance that day was so good that George W. Bush, the sitting president, made it clear to one and all who he would be supporting going into the election of that year, because John McCain had so totally dropped the ball. So we've seen something interesting play out that's not dissimilar. We've seen Donald Trump be on all sides of this issue, and his supporters be on all sides of this issue. Initially, of course, trying to suggest that there was no crisis, then that it was a hoax. We've seen people on Fox News, both hosts and guests, suggesting that this is just the latest in a long line of attempts by his opponents to oust him, that it's somehow the next in a cycle that began with Russia, then with Ukraine, with Mueller, etc., and that this was just a complete farce. Well, that clearly has not been proven to be the case. Then we've seen people within the Republican Party try to suggest that this is a weaponized virus of some sort, that this is all a big China plot, effectively. Then we saw Donald Trump suggesting that he wasn't going to have a test and didn't need a test, only to be revealed that he had already had a test for this, but he had proved negative. We're seeing a remarkable situation in as much as the president and the vice president, who were both of a certain age, appearing together in public repeatedly, despite the clear health warnings that come from such a joint appearance. The vice president, of course, I need to remind everybody, is ultimately there to succeed the president should his health require it. So it just seemed quite remarkable that in terms of a health crisis, these two men are standing side by side and indeed interacting with people who've been known to have contracted the virus. We've also seen Donald Trump give a very rare Oval Office address to the nation. This was his attempt to try to quell fears, to calm markets, and it had the exact opposite effect. It was a 10-minute address to the nation, which saw markets plunge almost with every word that he said. Some very interesting reporting in the Washington Post about the drafting of that speech, which, surprise, surprise, had Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller's fingerprints all over it. Apparently also with some ad-libbing by the president, who at times seemed to be struggling to read his auto cue. It really is quite remarkable. We've seen some historic addresses from the Oval Office in the past on national televised incidents. This was clearly an international crisis that demanded a speech to match the moment, and I think most people would agree that Donald Trump singularly failed to achieve that. He was caught in a hot mic moment on C-SPAN after the broadcast was concluded, which certainly didn't help the situation. And then this was compounded by the fact that Senator Biden, Vice President Biden, then spoke to the nation within 24 hours and gave what was seen as being quite a lucid address that was in marked contrast to that of President Trump. So both these men, I think, are trying to figure out how best to utilize the virus for their own political advantage. And at this point, Donald Trump has the power of the incumbency, but quite frankly, at this point, he seemed to be squandering that incumbency, I think, in terms of being unable to demonstrate his capacity as a chief executive officer of the United States.
Dr. James D. Boys there, and links below to follow his work on all of the usual platforms, with more info on the relaunch of the American Chronicle format to follow in the coming days. But just a little example there for you of the kind of analytical fun we used to get up to, and sincerely hope to be getting up to once again, transatlantically, as it were. For me, the last 6 years have pulled me creatively in many different directions, and at every point during that period I've wanted to bring all the respective elements together into one place and share the joy of the eternal crossroads with everyone I worked with and spent time with. This podcast and this moment, I hope, will provide the opportunity to, at long last, bring each of the greats from my various super circles, as I call them, together, and have all of those wonderful people who've shown me support over the years extend their interest and support to those that I bring together here. From today onwards, I feel we must demand that kind of partnership, not confrontation, through the spirit in which we communicate. The courageous fight here is to fight to reverse the ever-growing antagonism of the last 19 years, an antagonism, one might easily argue, grounded in a post-9/11 paradigm, a fledgling technological revolution, and a toxicity of regrettably justifiable mistrust. The rumblings of the distant drums threaten a relaxation, a repression of the lessons of this particular moment, and a likely repeat. A continuation of the unfounded honour presently to be found in ignorance, a failure of spirit beyond the mere adoration of now exposed and very penetrable systems. It can, of course, feel like we have had little say in the decision to begin this struggle. If we are to hold the line, however, it is crucial that we know why we must hold that line, in the here and now, and to imagine, with fortitude, that which we will overcome, and that which we will come to build. We leave you tonight with Jimmy Dorsey and Paul Madeira's 1941 ballad, I'm Glad There Is You, featuring Mark Rose on double bass and myself on microphone and piano. This has been Voice in the World. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Good luck, and ever onward to you all.
In this world of ordinary people, extraordinary people, I'm glad there is you. In this world of overrated pleasures and underrated treasures, I'm glad there is you. I live to love, and I love to live with you beside me. This road's on you, I'll muddle through with you to guide. In this world where many, many play at love and hardly any stay in love, I'm so glad there is you. more than ever.